It is the season to be jolly, but for most economies on the continent, it is also a season to be voting. Botswana, Namibia, Somalia, and the big daddy of the SADC region, South Africa, are all gearing up for an interesting 2019 election year. Welcome to Political Capital, the intersection of money and power. I am Karabole Tata. Tonight, we discuss the looming elections in Africa's most populated country and one of the most important economies anchoring the ECOWAS region. We will be discussing the diversification of that economy, dealing with insurgency, and also why Nigeria's elections are all about the economy. But first, following a 2-year delay, the Democratic Republic of Congo is heading to the polls on the 23rd of December, and for the first time in 21 years, the Kabila name will not be a factor at the polls. But is this the end of its persuasion? Joining me for this discussion is Ronak Gopaldas, who is a director at Signal Risk and a fellow at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Next to him is Diamond Tapiwa, who's a legal practitioner and an Afro expert. Gentlemen, for your time, I thank you both. Let's begin by looking at a name that has been said in reverent tones in the DRC for nearly 21 years. Is this the end of the Kabila persuasion when it comes to DRC's political power?
Well, I'll have a go at that. Interesting questions arising now. This election was meant to happen a couple of years ago. Obviously, that's been extended and pretended. Some call it a constitutional coup. And still, the jury's out around whether it's still going to happen. The opposition are now angling for a delay on account of the Ebola outbreak, on account of logistical difficulties, violence in certain part of the countries, as well as the voter card machines and the administration of that. So, there's a case being put forward around that. At Signal Risk, we personally believe that the election will go ahead, finally. And that's because, the way the chips have fallen, it's very much in the interest of Joseph Kabila and Emmanuel Shadari to get this done and dusted, whilst the developments in the oppositions have become more favourable towards the ruling coalition. So definitely, I think given that state of affairs, we're expecting the election to be done. What that means for the Kabila family and whether they adopt a more Machiavellian approach in the background or whether they step away from politics entirely, I think the jury's still out on.
Diamond, I think Ronak just listed all the reasons why in this country we would find a reason not to host the elections. I mean, the Ebola outbreak, the uncertainty, it doesn't sound like it's fertile ground to be having elections that have been delayed for 2 years. Fair?
Well, I think, yes, the ground is never fertile. If we wait for time, we'll never come to a point where we say we are ready for elections. We have seen in Africa, democracy that we have in Africa is an import. And I believe Africa has grappled to come to terms with that type of democracy. We need the voting system, the voting mechanism to be put in place. But the resources and the development that Africa has is not up to par with the type of democracy that we need. Like, for instance, in terms of security for the opposition parties, having an equal footing, having the same platform to market their views, and having civic organizations being able to assist in the political atmosphere of the country. Those things are never in the rightful place, and those things are never, they don't exist properly in Africa. But after all is said and done, elections in DRC have to take place. After a 2-year delay, I believe Joseph Kabila has done enough to protect his own personal interest in terms of the Kabila dynasty, because the person that is bringing in is his right-hand man and is going to protect himself from that.
Emmanuel Shadari. Now, that is an interesting pick. Some say he was handpicked by Joseph Kabila to actually just be a placeholder for 5 years. Here's a man who has sanctions against him. The EU looks at him not in a favorable light. They're saying that he had a role in the protest, in this dismantling the protest that we saw leading up to why the election date kept on getting postponed. Do you have confidence in the man? How can a country be led by a man who basically cannot travel in Europe?
So there are a couple of scenarios that could unfold over here. So there's what we call the Putin-Medvedev scenario, where there's this cosmetic puppeteering kind of setup at play.
I love that scenario. In that scenario, Putin comes back. So what are we saying about Joseph Kabila?
Yeah, so he's putting in place a proxy and a placeholder.
Are we saying 2023 he's back on the ballot?
Well, he's in a recent interview with a couple of international media agencies, which is very rare for Joseph Kabila. He's left that door open. So never rule anything out. So that's one scenario. The other is the kind of wildcard kind of scenario that we saw in Angola, where João Lourenço J-Lo took over from Eduardo dos Santos, and he's come in with a sweeping broom, and he's made huge changes, even instituting corruption charges against the former president's children. So, you know, which way is it going to go? You know, Shadari was picked for a very, very distinct reason, and that's because Joseph Kabila trusts him. In addition to that, the infrastructure around this transition has been set up in such a way that, you know, there's diplomatic immunity for Joseph Kabila in the event of a transition. He's stocked the military with allies who are very close to him as well. He's extended and pretended in such a way that he's divided and conquered the opposition. And amongst all the infighting that there is in the opposition ranks at the moment, it's very difficult to see how Shadari would lose this election.
Does the state of the shambolic affairs that we're seeing from the opposition make Martin Fayulu and I also ran? Is it a given that Emmanuel Shadari will come out victorious come the 23rd of December?
It is common cause that he's going to win. Whether the opposition party had a stronger hand, whether the opposition party had a stronger hand and they were organized, still there's been a trend in Africa. The ruling party always has got enough mechanisms to win elections.
Diamond, we've seen the trend be rebuked by Nigeria during its last elections. We saw a transition from the governing party then to an opposition party. Why can't we have that for DRC? And from a South African point of view, who's always seen protests at the embassy and things like that, I am inclined to believe that there is a disgruntled feeling amongst the population of the DRC, but why can't the opposition harness that?
The opposition party, there's so many candidates, about 23 candidates. And on their own, there's been a lot of fighting within themselves to say, I want to take power. I want to be the one whose name is going to be on the ballot. So that on its own further divides the opposition parties. And the more number that we have for the opposition parties, it also means that those are the more chances that the ruling party would have to win. And we have seen that happening in Zimbabwe with so many multiple parties, which then gives enough power, enough manpower, enough votes to the ruling party. And also the state of affairs in terms of the coming to the elections now, in terms of having enough mechanisms to protect the election. The opposition parties are at the back foot, and Kabila and them are a step ahead. So they won't have enough manpower to protect their vote. So I believe Kabila and them are going to take this.
Ronak, you want to get in here?
Yeah, I do. I think, you know, what's interesting here is that the opposition gained so much momentum because they were opposed to Kabila. When he blindsided them and he said that he wasn't going to run, they were scrambling. Now, they met in Geneva.
They don't have a common enemy.
Exactly. And we saw that in Egypt once Hosni Mubarak was deposed. You know, a transition and a revolution that promises everything to everyone is fragmented thereafter. So I think, you know, what we saw is that, you know, that common enemy was removed, and then the opposition themselves couldn't come up with a consensus candidate. You know, the candidacy of Martin Fayulu was endorsed and then revoked. They're infighting, and you could see further splintering. And unless they display a united force, with time running out now, it's going to be very difficult to dislodge the power of incumbency, which is something, you know, in a country that has never had a smooth transition of power democratically. Very difficult to see how that can happen amidst this infighting and you know, the disruption that we're seeing in the opposition ranks.
Felix Tshisekedi, gentlemen, to both of you. I mean, this is a name that's also revered in DRC politics. His father was an opposition leader for decades, and now he, you know, Felix is running, and that name is still a revered name within the political scene of the DRC. Do you see that carrying any mileage whatsoever?
It wouldn't carry much mileage in the DRC politics.
Why?
Because the opposition parties, like what I said earlier on, they don't have enough momentum now, like what my learned colleague was saying, in terms of having the common enemy. Because now Kabila is no longer sitting. So the chances are very slim that he's going to take it. And
yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's not the only name that we need to mention, right? So his father, Etienne Tshisekedi, political stalwart, is no longer on the scene. You know, there's Jean-Pierre Bemba, who was not eligible to contest the election, Moaz Katumbi as well. Those are you know, candidates who, according to polling data, which is sketchy at best, those are far more politically popular figures. So, you know, with those two candidates out of the equation, plus further fragmentation, again, you know, the cards are stacked very much in Kabila and Shadari's favor. So I think that dynamic means that, you know, the power of incumbency is very difficult to bet against.
I'm going to ask you, Diamond, a part of the DRC story has been, you know, this huge landmass that's really influenced by, it gets a lot of influence from its regional neighbors, if you will. The role of Rwanda, the role of Uganda has been very nuanced with the story of DRC. How much of that external influence do you still see factoring into what's going on today?
Probably, I could say, I don't know whether to say it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. What Kabila has done is that all the army generals, the ones who have, of course, have got atrocities, human rights atrocities on their names, he has taken them and has put them in high positions, right? So it then protects him from any incoming coup in the country. It protects him from that. And also we've seen that the issues of infighting within DRC, coming from the Burundi, coming from Rwanda, and in areas in the western region, where it's most like a wild west. There's no rule of law in that area. But the influence from the outside, as long as Kabila and his company will still be in power, I foresee them being able to counter any external forces which might come in, because he's got the support of the army generals on his side. And we see when he took over from his father in around about 2001, he has managed to, I could say, probably have peace in the country, and there's less fighting. Yes, of course, the conflict is still going on, but he has managed to stabilize it a bit.
Ronak, the DRC is a huge landmass. It's very difficult to control politically, let alone to campaign for elections in such a fragmented and you know, a country that is challenged by many variety of different assaults. For you, what are you telling interested clients, people who are looking at the DRC from an economic point of view? Are you telling them to take a wait and see approach? Do you believe that this could be a turning of the page?
So I think I'm, you know, neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. And, you know,
okay, what does that mean for your clients?
So for you know, clients who are engaged in the DRC, they're primarily interested in the mining sector. DRC passed a new mining code earlier this year. It was something that provoked a great reaction from international mining companies. They weren't very happy with it. They saw it as a continuation of this wave of resource nationalism. Obviously, the government in the DRC framed it as, you know, just getting a fair share of what's due to them, and that's something that that is going to feature very strongly on the radars of international investors.
A big thank you to Diamond Tapiwa, who is a legal practitioner and an Afro expert. I keep Roland here for the second part of the discussion as we continue to traverse the world of African elections, and Nigeria is up next. Welcome back to Political Capital, where money meets power. Nigeria's economy grew 1.8% in the third quarter of 2018 versus a year ago. But according to Moody's, Nigeria's credit profile is constrained by the sovereign balance sheet's continued exposure to shocks because the government has been unable to expand its non-oil revenue base in any meaningful manner. Still joining me for this discussion is Ronak Gopaldas, who is the Director for Signal Risk and a Fellow at GIBS. Ronak, economy is squarely in focus. But first of all, Nigeria must deal with its presidential candidate, or at least one of, who came out last week saying he is alive, and contrary to popular reports that he is of good health. How important is Muhammadu Buhari for Nigeria's next election? And is he the man for the future, considering how absent he's been in the last term?
So it depends who you speak to, right?
Okay.
So I'm speaking to businesses in Nigeria with a Pan-African focus, and they're all pretty split around who's going to be the better candidate for the economy. So on the one hand, investors are really jaded. They want the election done and dusted as soon as possible. They want clarity around the economy, and they want to get on with things. They kind of know what they're getting with President Buhari. His economic ideology hasn't really changed much since the 80s. He's what you'd call an economic nationalist, you know, heavy-handed approach to regulation. At the moment, kind of a big anti kind of private sector foreign investment kind of approach, evidenced by issues with MTN. I don't need to tell you a lot about that. And then that's in contrast with his rival, who's also not a new face, President or candidate Atiku Abubakar. He was the former President Olusegun Obasanjo's vice president,
of course.
And he's seen as a more private sector oriented and more pro-business candidate.
But you could argue Abubakar is relatively younger compared to Muhammadu Buhari, who has not spent most of his presidency within Nigeria. So technically, he would be a sell, wouldn't he?
Well, the devil you know or the one you don't. So that's I mean, you know, to use a turn of phrase, that's what the investor psychology is at the moment.
Okay.
They kind of know what they're getting. They know it's suboptimal and less than ideal, but they kind of know what the rules of the game are. Whereas, given the last transition that they had in 2015 on the back of change, goodwill, Buhari effect, and the dividend, which never really materialized, a lot of businesses are not willing to take that risk again, and they'd rather say that the risk of disruption is not worth it. So suboptimal status quo or the risk of transition is the psychology. The reality is that, you know, there are a few things that, regardless of who wins, need urgent attention. So,
and that's what I wanted to talk about, that Muhammadu Buhari dividend that you speak about. Let's look at Nigeria. It's still pretty much facing the same issues that it faced before Muhammadu Buhari. High youth unemployment, the electricity and the power generation remains a problem there. According to Moody's, they haven't diversified enough from non-oil revenues. So what has he been able to achieve, really?
So there were a lot of own goals initially, you know. So
the story of African economies.
Exactly. So I mean, you know, it took 6 months to appoint a cabinet. The handling of the regulatory environment, I've mentioned MTN already.
And that's how they get judged, you know, from at least the South African point of view. You know, you look at Nigeria, who could potentially be paying a second huge fine in 5 years. That looks like that's how Nigeria deals with private sector business. Yeah,
so once bitten, twice shy, and a lot of investors who were kind of curious or keen or interested in Nigeria will sit on the sidelines until there's clarity. And that I think has been the biggest travesty of this administration, is that they've spooked foreign investors because the rules of the game are not really clear. Now, going forward, what needs to happen? The structural challenges are pretty obvious. The country needs to diversify away from oil. The price of oil is a big determinant of the country's health. But, you know, Atiku is promising, you know, a lot of stuff that financial markets like to hear. How realistic it is open for debate. He wants to turn Nigeria by 2025 into a $900 billion economy. He wants to privatize a lot. He will potentially change the governor of the Reserve Bank, and he wants to scrap the various exchange rates and do a free-floating currency. But now, all of this sounds kind of pretty utopian and very ambitious and not really realistic.
But that is exactly what Nigeria needs. It needs to lead that ECOWAS region as a whole by taking the first step forward. When I look at the two candidates, I see Muhammadu Buhari, who's a man for the past, a man who has, you know, noble intentions for his home country and its people, but he's not really a man for the fourth industrial revolution, while Atiku, from a benefit of being young alone and being a very business-friendly kind of predisposition, that I could see him as a man who should be leading Nigeria.
We've got to distinguish between rhetoric and reality, though.
Okay.
Talk is cheap, right? So, and we saw this with Buhari. You know, what the political constraints and the realities are, the horse trading, the strategic alliances that need to be brokered in such a way that you please the people that put you in power, is tricky in Nigeria. It's a big country with very different political ideologies. So what you know, there's a phrase that goes, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose.
Of course.
And so, you know, that's I think going to be the challenge. Nigeria's issues are well documented. You know, we don't need to rehash them. But who is going to have the political will to do that is the big question. And also, you know, there's another piece of baggage that Atiku has in the sense that he's very rich, and you know, he's amassed a lot of that wealth. And the allegation that will be thrown at him from the Buhari camp and the APC is that this was done through corrupt means. Now, you know, he's going to have to fight that allegation. So effectively, what you've got this election coming down to is a candidate who's arguably an economic nationalist, who's arguably more pro-poor, versus a more business-friendly candidate, but has got a few skeletons in the closet.
Is this essentially a two-horse race between the PPRD and the ACP? And what does that mean for the rest of the over 90 political parties that are part of the election mix? Yeah,
I mean, you know, the Nigerian president's not going to be anyone other than Muhammadu Buhari or Atiku Abubakar, right? Unless there's a health issue or something unforeseen. Now, you know, one of the usual issues that is usually a factor is the issue of zoning, ethnicity, and religion. They're both northern Muslims, so you know, a bit of the sting is taken out of that. You know, which way momentum is going to go is going to be interesting. You know, in the past, you would very seldom bet against the power of incumbency, but in 2015 we saw that changed.
Good luck,
And the West African region in general has seen a lot of political transitions. Ghana is famous for that. Sierra Leone and Liberia saw that happen. So you know, the political contours and the dynamics in West Africa are evolving and changing somewhat. So you know, it's going to be a very close race. I would suggest, and you know, our core view at Signal Risk is that the smart money at this stage is on President Buhari, and we wouldn't bet against the incumbent.
We used to say the same thing in 2015. We were surprised, and you know, gladly so. But how important is Nigeria's election when you look at the context of the West African regional bloc, ECOWAS?
Well, it's the economic dynamo. It's the superpower. It's the biggest economy on the continent.
So its elections will say something to the rest of the region, right?
Yeah, and you know, there's a lot of anxiety around elections. That's not anything new. But you know, what does this mean for the economy? Is it going to continue to be in a slumber, or are we going to get a catalytic effect where, you know, there's a change in policy, or there are new policies, and investors have the framework and the economic and regulatory framework to be confident in their investment decisions? Ronak, because at the moment it's very much a case of wait and see, and let's get this thing done.
Ronak, is any of these presidential candidates, will the election give us some sort of a favorable view towards that big document that the rest of Africa has signed, that Nigeria has not penned itself to, that all, you know, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? Do you see that being moved by any of the issues that will be brought up in this elections?
So we know that the economic ideologies of each candidate are very different, right? So, you know, President Buhari is much more protectionist in his orientation,
and hence they haven't penned their name there.
Whereas, you know, the former Vice President Abubakar is much more.
He's more of a trade-friendly kind of guy.
Yeah, so much more investment promotion oriented, and I think he'd be much more sympathetic. And look at the African Free Trade Agreement in a much more positive light. But you know, we're speculating, and you know, as is typical in Nigeria, there's policy inertia before the election, so we're not expecting much to be done on that front.
The electorate remains the final arbiter of who should be the incumbent. Nigeria has a youth, like any other African country really, has a youth bulge, if you will. Those people are eligible to vote, and they will most likely, well, given the right kind of impetus and inspiration, they could take to the polls. How important will the youth vote be, and where does it go?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, it's what you call the Facebook versus the facelift generation. Nigeria is a young country. It's governed by old men, and you know, both candidates are.
You're speaking about Africa, my friend.
So you know, there's that disconnect. Which way will they go? You know, the thing is, there's a lack of imagination around the current candidates because they've been part of the political system for a long time. And I think that, you know, dilutes a lot of the surprise factor or the shock factor. You know, there's a candidate that's part of the establishment that's contesting the election. And then you've got President Buhari, who is well known, and what he's about is well known. The last election was about anti-corruption and about the security. And that's what President Buhari campaigned on and what the big ticket election issues were. Will that be the same? At the moment, the economy has been the big focus. So it remains to be seen. But I think, you know, the sense I get from speaking to people on the ground in Nigeria and the general mood is that let's just get this thing done and dusted.
Ronak Gopaldas, Director at Signal Risk and a Fellow at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. I thank you for your time, sir, and for being on the show. It's long overdue. We will be back on your screens next Tuesday with another episode of Political Capital. Until then, keep it locked on CNBC Africa. Good evening.